Hey guys, what's up? It's me, Thomas. Today we're back here with extra history. Today, well, we're checking out a bit one that's gonna hit close to home to some people. American Mass Deportation. Yeah. I think Oscar was worried about this a while back, but not sure how things are now. Anyway, first episode is called the First Crackdown, which, oh boy, not sure how far back we're going on this one, so never really seen the history on this one, but let's check it out, huh? Be sure to like, subscribe for more. Hope you enjoy. Let's go.
Okay, I hear y'all. You're all asking at this point, why are you doing this series? Well, let me tell you a little story to answer that.
Okay.
Back in 2015, our head writer, Rob, was watching a Republican primary debate when then-candidate Donald Trump said something that pricked up Rob's ears. Oh, and don't worry, I'm not going to do the voice, but the quote is this. Let me just tell you that Dwight Eisenhower, good president, great president, people liked him. I like Ike, right? The expression I like Ike moved 1.5 million illegal immigrants out of this country. Moved them just beyond the border,
Fair.
They came back. Moved them again beyond the border and they came back, didn't like it. Moved them way south, they never came back. Dwight Eisenhower, you don't get nicer, you don't get friendlier. They moved 1.5 million people out. We have no choice, we have no choice. Curious, Rob then started Googling a few search terms and then his jaw hit the floor. What was being referenced by Trump there was a 1954 program of mass removals that he'd never heard of. A military-style operation that involved law enforcement, mass transit, and several dozen deaths from people being abandoned in the desert. This and a similar operation in the Great Depression would be America's first attempts at mass deportation. Operations that some would see as a black mark on American history, others would view as an instruction manual, and most, including myself, have never heard about at all.
Yep, forgotten part of history. We're about to check it out.
This first part of our historical tale is brought to you by our streaming service, Nebula, but more on how we're working with them to safeguard series like this one after the episode.
Right.
One of the really cool things about history is that there's so much of it, you will never know everything. In fact, one reason history is so fascinating is that it's just normal to discover something new or learn a perspective you never considered. But there is another side to that, which is that things might fall through the cracks that are important to understanding a period or your own world. And that is the very reason we're doing a series on these crackdowns. The first of which launched amid the Depression, while the second, the reprehensibly named Operation Wetback, was a much larger effort in 1954. We'll cover the lead up to them, their aims, implementation, consequences, and the resistances against them. But the first thing to point out is that America's struggle with immigration and the rights of non-citizens living within its borders has been going on nearly since the founding. In 1798, the young United States found itself on the brink of war with France. Though the French had supported the American struggle for independence, the two nations had been driven apart by the radicalism of the French Revolution, America's embrace of Britain as a trading partner, and French attacks on American merchants. Though, come to think of it, on the brink of war is underselling it. The US was in an undeclared naval war with France, and there were worries that it would escalate. This was particularly frightening for the Federalist Party and the Adams administration, since their rivals in the Democratic-Republican Party were generally fans of the French Revolution and tended to lap up the votes of more newly arrived Americans, including those from France. So the
Fair, but then again, a lot of the stuff you can see there might be seen over there. But you have to admit, they did stand with the British, so it makes sense for them to do that, but oh boy. I mean, I'm having a hard time remember where we are in the French Revolution at that time. I think this was after, I mean, remember, 1789, so King's gotta be dead. So, wait, I don't know. Hard to say Reign of Terror yet, but still, yeah. Once that Reign of Terror thing got going, that would be like, okay, they traded one monarchy for a dictatorship. Not good. Anyway.
The Federalists used their majority in Congress to pass 4 new laws grouped under the term the Alien and Sedition Acts. These
I
acts
think I
were
remember this.
essentially a way for the Federalists to attack their opposition party and hobble their electoral advantages. The Sedition Act, which made it a crime to speak or write false or scandalous things about the government, was used to prosecute Democratic Republican newspapers. Meanwhile, the Alien Acts targeted the new citizens that were expanding the opposition's base. The government now had the power to deport aliens and raised residency requirements for citizenship from 5 to 14 years. Finally, the act respecting alien enemies gave the government special powers in case of a, quote, declared war or any invasion or predatory incursion, unquote. With an emergency declared, the president could direct enemy aliens to be arrested, imprisoned, and deported. Now, these acts were massively unpopular and probably lost the Federalists the election of 1800. After all, it was a blatant attempt to attack another political party and its supporters while crushing protections enshrined in the Bill of Rights only a decade beforehand. But it was also the first time the government's power to deport whole classes of non-citizens were spelled out. Throughout the 1800s, immigration would be a point of friction in American politics. Various groups, such as Irish Catholics and Italians, arrived due to conditions in their own countries. See our series on the Irish potato famine for more on that. And ended up in conflict with native-born citizens over low-wage jobs. But despite an increase in xenophobia and conspiracy theories featuring immigrants and Catholics, deportation was not generally used on them. However, this was not true when it came to Chinese immigrants. Thousands of Chinese had immigrated to the American West during the Gold Rush, most famously in building the Transcontinental Railroad. By this time, anti-immigrant groups were successful in passing legislation to constrain Asian immigration. The 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act barred all Chinese immigration or even entry into the United States for 10 years. It would then be regularly extended for 60 years until 1943, when it proved embarrassing given that China had joined the Allies in the war against Japan. Part of the justification was that Chinese culture was just too different and separate to ever truly assimilate into the US. Yet the Chinese Exclusion Act was not just about choking off entry. It would also expand to give the government permission to deport Chinese people who were believed to be indigent, criminal, engaged in the sex trade, or presumed to be a burden on the state. These crackdowns often grew more stringent in bad economic times, when white workers would take a step down economically and start competing for low-paying jobs. However, in practice, deporting individuals proved to be more difficult than expected. Chinese community groups in San Francisco were not going down without a fight and ensured those served deportation orders knew that there was a formal process. First, the migrant needed to be notified of the deportation order, then they could appeal the deportation order in a hearing. This process gave the potential deportee recourse. Plus, the deportee's country had to agree to receive them, which it didn't always agree to do. So, in other words, formal deportation could quickly become mired in both court cases and diplomatic wrangling, making mass deportation essentially impossible. So
Yeah, even that point, I would have been like, okay, look, as long as they don't cause trouble, we can help them, okay? Give them a chance. I think that's the problem. People always, campaign for like some mass deportations, but you gotta realize sometimes these people don't have a reason to go back, or if the country even wants them. Land of the free, home of the brave. You gotta give them a chance, otherwise you're just being a racist douchebag. Anyway,
immigrant groups looked for other methods. Some of these involved violence and a wave of anti-Asian murders and assaults that swept across the West, particularly in California. But these garnered negative headlines for towns at a time when a place's reputation was important for attracting new residents and investment. So they tried another tactic, one known as the Truckee method. Truckee, California was a mountain town that was about 40% Chinese, with most Chinese residents working in logging, transport, and service industry jobs. In 1876, a vigilante group known as the Caucasian League had tried to drive them out by lighting 2 cabins on fire and shooting anyone who ran out, killing a middle-aged Chinese man. Local school principal and newspaper editor Charles McGlashan, himself part of the Caucasian League, then started exploring other pressure options in the 1880s. The first involved spreading rumors that all Chinese men would have their queues cut off in the street after a certain date, a grave insult in Chinese culture. And though one white supporter did cut a man's queue, that tactic failed. So McGlashan ordered a boycott. White citizens refused to provide any money to Chinese businesses, wouldn't sell them goods, and let all Chinese workers go. Wow. Meanwhile, members of the paramilitary Caucasian League engaged in intimidation and violent sabotage by dynamiting the water tank on the Chinese side of town and engaging in arson attacks on businesses and barns. The campaign of fear and economic pressure worked. And by 1900, only 2 Chinese people were still living in Truckee. McGlashan went on to get elected to the California State Assembly, where he promoted the Truckee method and its tactics of economic boycott and terror to other towns across California. The idea was to scare Chinese migrants out of their communities and ultimately back to China. This started to coalesce in an informal type of deportation known as self-deportation. The idea being to make everyday life so hostile for an immigrant that they would choose to return to their home country. Not that it was much of a choice. As the 20th century dawned, the focus of anti-immigrant campaigns switched from Chinese communities to more recently arrived groups of European Catholics and Jewish refugees fleeing from pogroms in Eastern Europe. Similarly, the First World War put pressure on the German community. Increasingly, deportations were based on the idea of keeping undesirable political ideologies out of the United States. After a series of anarchist bombings and the assassination of William McKinley, who we actually did our last series on, you can check that out here, and especially anti-war activism by the party during World War I, prominent anarchists such as Emma Goldman were deported largely for their speech. However, there was still the problem of formal deportation being expensive, slow, and often messy when it came to foreign affairs. After all, what if a deportee needed to be returned to, for example, the Soviet Union, given that the US had cut off relations? But by that time, local law enforcement and the Bureau of Immigration, then under the Department of Commerce and Labor, since immigration was considered a wage and jobs issue, had come up with a workaround: voluntary departure. This differed from the so-called self-deportation, in that it began with an arrest or taking of a foreigner into custody. When the officer discovered they were not a U.S. citizen, the authority figure could offer the detained person the opportunity to leave the U.S. voluntarily and even get assistance from the U.S. government in doing so. And since they had opted to leave voluntarily rather than be formally deported, there was actually a bonus. People formally deported have a black mark against them that prevents them from re-entering the United States, but voluntary departure did not carry this penalty. In fact, there would likely be no record at all. Local law enforcement could simply hand arrestees over to the Bureau of Immigration to send back. It saved time, it saved the courts money, and it could be done on a massive scale. Actually, historians who study this subject don't know exactly how many people were deported through voluntary departure and self-deporting, but there is evidence that these make up the majority of deportations from the 1920s through the 1960s. It also opened the door to a much darker tactic, because in 1924, Congress founded the U.S. Border Patrol as the police enforcement arm focusing on the porous land borders with Mexico and Canada. Another act that same year criminalized entering the U.S. outside of a non-designated crossing point. That meant anyone who had come into the country outside the proper channels was now automatically deportable, and immigration authorities could detain essentially anyone who looked Mexican under suspicion of illegally crossing. So, with its new enforcement wing, the Bureau of Immigration was now ready for its first attempt at mass deportation.
Sorry, just the more I watch this, the more it just feels like people back then were just racist without even being saying it. Like, seriously. The fact that they could just, arrest someone for being Mexican, for just looking at him. Like, seriously, don't assume. God. Sorry, just dark. No kidding, this thing's just a black mark. I mean, I know we shouldn't. I know I hate this, but we gotta learn this stuff because, well, this could really help. Show them what they went through, how people used to treat them. Treat them better. And why Trump is so gung ho about the whole deportation thing. This might give us a clue. Just saying. Anyway.
Came in 1931, when the Great Depression increased anti-immigrant feeling as jobs became scarce and people competed for low-wage labor they might not have considered doing before. Union groups and labor organizations joined the call for a crackdown, feeling that migrant labor was undercutting their earnings and gave bosses ready-made scabs. As a result, labor put its shoulder behind the political task of removals. The virulent anti-immigrant feeling was particularly sharp in Los Angeles, California, where the Mexican-American population had grown following looser immigration checks at the southern border in the years leading up to World War I. Many especially came to work in the agricultural industries that, before urban sprawl, lay much closer to the city. Meanwhile, most farm owners didn't see a problem and conveniently looked the other way when it came to workers without proper papers. But the city council wanted them out, so city officials and LAPD began to talk to the Border Patrol. La Placita Olvera, Los Angeles, February 26, 1931. There's a party going on. Woohoo. Food sellers, dancing, music floating, echoing off old adobe buildings.
Hey.
This is where Los Angeles began, as a Spanish pueblo dating back 150 years. Now, of course, it is the Old Town, the heart of Mexican Los Angeles, a place to socialize and feel the community spirit on a bright afternoon like this one, except for today. Because today becomes filled with shouts, orders. Men in military green move down the street, armed with pistols and batons. Others in plain clothes push from the other end of the street. The people are surrounded. Over the next several hours, the Border Patrol keeps 400 people sitting on the ground, going from person to person to check papers and demand proof of citizenship. Keep in mind, this was one of the first immigration raids in U.S. history, so many people don't have their documents on hand. Now, accounts differ on how many people were taken to the train station and deported as a result of the La Placita raid. But one thing is for certain. It had the intended effect. It terrifies the Mexican community in LA. Over the next several years, the Los Angeles government and immigration authorities, including the Immigration and Naturalization Service formed in 1933, will continue this, quote, repatriation program. Border Patrol will show up at dances or family parties in shock raids, establishing a cordon so anyone who runs will be caught. They'll stop people for minor infractions based on skin color, accuse them of crossing the border illegally, then lean on them for voluntary return. The point is not to formally deport. It is to make living in the United States so terrifying that most migrants are intimidated into self-deporting. Crowds of Mexican people are regular sights at the city's train station, waving goodbye to friends and family who are, in many cases, U.S. citizens born in California. Over the 1930s, 1 million Mexicans and Mexican-American, men, women, and children, will leave LA as a result of the campaign, most through self-deportation and voluntary return, which was the point. To create a climate of fear that avoided due process. An estimated 1.8 million would leave nationally. And this was just a rehearsal, because as World War II loomed, wartime needs would see a sudden change in the government's attitude toward Mexican migrant laborers. But even as the US government welcomed the same people it had just driven out, the Border Patrol was increasing enforcement actions, building a deportation capacity that would be used in the reprehensibly named Operation Wetback. And in this, they had a surprising partner, the government of Mexico, which, again, is history.
Jeez, yeah. Man, looking back at this, you gotta feel bad for the migrants. Like, they come here for a better life, and they're just like, just get harassed to the point they're like, screw this, I'm out of here. But, jeez. Like, you just feel bad, you know? Just wish it would stop, but, it's pretty much going in secret nowadays, I think. You know what I mean? Trump's giving them a voice. Well, anyway, thanks for watching, guys. See ya.